Hello and welcome to this edition of our CNBC Africa Special Report. My name is Michael Mjisha. Now, back in March 2018 here in Kigali was the signing of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, where we saw over 40 African countries signing this particular agreement, where we expect, or the African Union expects, the intra-African trade to go from a current standing at 15% to over 52% in just a matter of 4 to 5 years. Now, joining us tonight on the show, of course, we will be looking at how the youth are actually having a role, or what role are the youth playing in the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And of course, joining us tonight from my extreme left is Governor of Makueni County. His name is Kivutha Kibwana. And of course, moving on, there is Joyce Awoshika, and she is the Managing Director of Oriki, all the way from Lagos. And to my immediate left is a very good friend of mine, actually, Lionel Mfizi, CEO of Osomity Labs. Now, of course, thank you very much for creating time to speak to us. Rather a very interesting evening where we get to look at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, one of the biggest agreements that have been signed and expected to make Africa the biggest free market in the world. Now, this has seen its issues, of course, because we were looking at 40 countries signing, but we're still seeing a very slow pace at actually ratifying the documents and handing them in so that this can get into place. Now, of course, let's get away from all of this. We've seen a lot of talk about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, but we haven't seen any youth involvement in the implementation of this particular agreement. Now, this brings a lot of analysts to say that it might end up as the Sustainable Development Goals. Some say no, some say yes. What's your take, Lionel?
The way I see it, the youth could be more involved, even though I think we are involved without knowing we are involved. The thing is, every day we wake up, go to work, and then we're trying to develop ourselves, trying to develop our country, and we're trying to create something new, right? In the end, the collaborative effort of every startup in Kigali is towards developing Rwanda. Developing Rwanda helps to get Rwanda to a standard where it could be really a very good place to be for the free trade area. So I believe we are participating not as much as we should, but we are in a way, and I believe we could improve that. We should improve that, by the way.
All right. Joyce, as an entrepreneur from Nigeria, a country that actually hasn't been on with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, do you see any youth involvement, at least from across the continent, towards this particular conversation?
You know, similar to what Lionel said, I would agree that the youth needs to play a bigger role. As we all know, we have a huge population of youth on the continent of Africa. And we also know we have a major unemployment issue as well. And we know that once this AfCFTA is ratified, we're actually opening up employment opportunities across the continent. So in my country, Nigeria, we actually have not signed yet. And I believe that one of the roles that youth can play is actually to speak to our policymakers. What is holding us back? Making sure that we share with them how important it is to us as entrepreneurs, young people, in having this document signed, and how it's going to basically open the borders for us, and how this will inevitably impact the continent in a very positive way.
You know why I'm actually coming to you with this kind of a conversation is because we know that the population of Lagos only is bigger than that of Rwanda, and it's also bigger than that of Uganda. And we're looking at Uganda as one of, the biggest economies in East Africa. But these are countries that are already on with this particular conversation, and most analysts do believe that Nigeria is set to actually earn more from the global value chain, from the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, than from the oil sector. Tell me, what are the youth actually doing to see that they can get involved? Are they going to wait for the governments to actually push them, or do we see the youth also taking initiative to be like, hey, this is our time, we need to do this?
That's such a great question. Since May 2018 till now, I've not seen the amount of rallying needed behind the youth as there needs to be. I believe that there's also a point of education that needs to happen with the youth about the importance of this document and what it is. I feel like in silos, entrepreneurs like me, I have a business that once this agreement is signed, it opens up the doors for me to trade with Rwanda. When there's some ingredients that I would love from Rwanda that would make it easier for me to do business with Rwanda. But I don't know that enough youth actually understand the importance of it. And it's actually making me realize that I need to actually go back to Nigeria and also think about how to gather some efforts and get our policymakers on the table and ask them, what are the next steps? Let's sign this document and let's move forward.
With that, of course, allow me to now just move a little bit from that particular conversation and take you to something. Again, we're looking at the average age of Africans to be at the age of 19. If we look at the 1.216 billion people on the continent, with 200 million of them being between the age of 15 and 35, at least the average age is 19. When you look at the implementers or the policymakers on the continent are in their 50s, 60s, don't you think at some point maybe the African Union is off script here? Can we get more youth involved with these decisions making?
I think that's a very legitimate observation in terms of the policymakers at the top are old people, and the majority of Africans who really want real development action are young people. And so we owe them to speed up policies, to speed up whatever action that will begin to unlock Africa for their progress. And even in terms of the first question that you asked, I think the youth usually do not get involved, particularly at a treaty level when treaties are being made. And I think it is important that they begin to focus on that so that they don't just say AU is for the presidents, the ministers, the big people. So that even at the grassroots, they begin to say that these policies at the continental level, this is our take about them. This is what we want to happen. Because from before we really, when Nkrumah, when NASA, when Gaddafi, all those people were talking, even Jomo Kenyatta, were talking about continental unity, where all these questions that we are now discussing would have been settled a long time ago. So I think first it's important for the youth to start being very proactive. And attending this meeting, Africa Connect, of young people, I have seen the energy, I have seen the entrepreneurial ability. I have seen that these are people who are raring to go, but they need to be facilitated, particularly in terms of policy, in terms of government support. And even though the policymakers are older people, the youth have to penetrate that space. They have to be aggressive because when these borders are opened, when it is possible, like at 2025, a quarter of those who are 25 and below will be Africans. So you can see the urgency of the matter, and I can only plead to the leadership of the continent, the political leadership of the continent, so that they very deliberately involve young people in terms of these key decisions that have to be made, because after all, we are making them for the young people.
All right. If I could quickly comment on that, about the age gap. The way I see it, the 50-year-old policymakers are there to say, you are now able to do this, that, and that. But us, the young people, we're the ones to be able to be told, or we're the ones to come up with the use cases of how these things should be implemented. We're the ones to say, we think infrastructure should now work this way in the free trade area because it's going to be for our benefit. It's going to be us who use it. So I think we should be involved at the level where we come up with use cases of how this can benefit us. But then the policymakers tell us, you cannot do this. So now you have the platform to make that change.
Joyce, of course, the CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Area, comes in with free access to markets. But the question now is, how can we make sure that this is achieved as soon as possible? Because entrepreneurs on the continent are yearning to have this moving as fast as possible because we don't have the time. We've waited since the the colonial era, the 60s, the 50s, to have an Africa that actually streamlines everything, the Africa that can promote as a single market. With this development we've gotten to, how fast can we achieve it?
I wish I could answer that question, in a black and white way. If I could answer, I would say I wish it could have been done yesterday. But the truth of the matter is, from what I understand, it takes every single country getting on board, right? So we can take strides towards it as we are. I think on a country level, those countries that haven't signed, there needs to be extra pressure and extra effort put together to get them on board. As you rightly said, the market will be open, and this is going to be huge for industrialization, for creation of jobs, for trade, from even approaching the world as one single unit, the great continent that we are. And so it needs to happen immediately. But once again, it's going to take everyone getting on board, or at least, the majority moving forward.
All right, and now, of course, Governor, we do know that intra-Africa trade stands currently at only 15%, and this is a number without the labor mobility. Yeah. Now, of course, if we're looking at growing this number to a 52% of intra-Africa trade before the end of 2024 or 2025, because we're looking at a very short period of time to have this happen. Tell me, how can we get, or what are the measures that need to be put in place or strategies to actually have this happen in the shortest time, and we bring these numbers up?
I think one of the points has been mentioned in terms of, first of all, fast-tracking this free trade agreement among African countries. And I think, as was aptly pointed out, the youth have a role so that they can actually lobby the leadership of each country, because they benefit most from the realization of free trade on the continent. They meet abroad, like some of the youth here who are doing startups, who are doing very creative entrepreneurial work. They meet abroad when they are studying, and they actually don't meet that much in Africa, because most of the good universities perhaps are abroad. So I think that particular point of lobbying is very important, and also because there are already some regional blocks, so that one can explore within the East African, for example, community, ECOWAS, SADC, all those regional blocks, to also explore how fast can they facilitate free movement of persons, of goods, of services, so that when that begins to happen there, maybe some of the fears that people have of competition and so on can be lessened, so that that activity at the regional level becomes a precursor for now the realization of free trade at the continental level, including, I think we need to dream big, including eventually an African country, one African country, because we owe it to them. Why do we trade so much with abroad? Abroad meaning outside Africa. We trade with Europe, we trade with China, we trade with all those countries, but we don't trade enough with ourselves, as we have pointed out. So I think if we maybe approach the regional, we approach the regional level or sub-regional level, if Africa is a region, so that we examine within those institutions what trade can we do there, and even just neighboring countries, so that neighboring countries, we begin, and some of these problems that we think we have in terms of competing with each other, begin to be lessened. Just to conclude, in a discussion before we came here, I was informed that in this country, it takes about 6 hours to get to register a company. But in some neighboring African countries, it takes like 6 months. And so he was asking a friend, why don't you come here, register it in Rwanda, and then you can go back into your country and use it, if the law allows. So you see, those are the frustrations that young people have, because some of these things don't make a lot of sense, and they're in a hurry to get Africa going.
All right, your take on this?
For me, I completely agree with the governor. He made a good point about regional blocs as well. ECOWAS, for example, has a role to play in nudging, some of the countries who haven't signed the agreement as well. I'd also say, in regards to the youth as well, in Nigeria, they recently passed the Not Too Young to Run bill, which basically lowered the age that anyone can contest for presidency, for Senate, for House, for gubernatorial. And it's really important that more young people, to buttress what Lionel was saying, more young people get involved at the policy level as well. That's when we're going to be able to see the changes. We can't always ask for permission. We must have a seat at the table. And if we have a young person at the table who's able to make decisions, we can all rally behind that young person and make sure that they achieve our agenda. That's another way to quicken this process as well.
But Joyce, is a seat at the table the necessity right now? Is it the red or blue pill that we're looking for, a seat at the table?
No, I think that we can use our lobbying efforts, we can use our voice in the meantime. I think we can force a seat at the table in that regard. We can meet with our policymakers and push our agenda with them, get one that's already in position to further our agenda. So we don't necessarily have to have an active seat, because as we know, there's cycles, for elections, and it's not an immediate thing. But I think it's very important that our voice is heard. If that's considered a seat, then that's an important thing right now.
Now, of course, we know that Africa has quite a big infrastructure gap, and we can't talk about the AfCFTA before we talk about this particular conversation. I want to drive it to Lionel, and maybe we'll just jump back to the governor, because of sitting in the government, he pretty much knows a lot about this. But I'll start with you, because you also base on this to grow your business. Tell me, what needs to be done to harness the case of an infrastructure gap that we have on the continent? How fast should we move towards harnessing this as well?
I'll start by giving you an example. Yesterday I had a quick coffee meeting with a friend from Morocco. He told me that to get to Rwanda, he had to fly first to Doha and then come back to Rwanda. The full travel time was about 20 hours. Now, Rwanda is not that far from Morocco, but it takes 20 hours for a person to get here.
It takes less time to fly from Japan to Los Angeles.
Exactly. Now imagine that is already one of the biggest roadblocks for trade. For my particular business, I am blessed to be born in an internet age where we're able to expand services, delivering services where the internet has no borders. So to us, the free trade area has always been there when building our solutions. But when we're coming back to infrastructure, if suppose we wanted to deploy one of our systems in suppose a country like Somalia, where internet prices are very high, or where there's like some other countries that have poor infrastructure for internet, then it kind of hinders our business. So I believe, as I said before, we have to lay down the use cases of how this can benefit us. And then as the youth, I believe we are the guinea pigs of these generations, where we have to sacrifice ourselves to say, let us build the roads, let us build the infrastructure for internet, for that the next guys who come now can truly benefit from this. But it is up to us to say, I like how she said that we cannot always wait for permission to do things. An example that other countries can copy is the sandbox approach, where the regulations authority in Rwanda give you a sandbox area if you're attempting a new business which they have not regulated yet. I believe if more countries adopt this area, then more young people are allowed to create businesses, to do things which prepare for the next generations of entrepreneurs who will really benefit from the trade area.
Basically, what you mean is that we need a divide between the soft and hard infrastructure.
You can put it that way, yeah.
All right, let me jump to the governor, of course. Governor Kivuta, we are looking at this infrastructure gap. Of course, it has a lot to do with governance, with the policymakers. But has the biggest hindrance to the infrastructure gap or infrastructure development in Africa been necessarily lack of funds, like financement, to actually make this happen? Or has it been the lack of visionary leaders who actually see the use or the need for infrastructure to be put in place?
I think in terms of traveling to Europe, traveling to China, all those places, it was assumed that that is how we would always do our trade. That is how we would go out to study, to do political, work like at the UN and so on and so forth. So, and of course, in terms of Europe, America, Asia, trading with us, it was assumed that that's where, the air routes, that is what was really critical. It didn't occur that if in Africa we also developed, as he has pointed out, we developed the way of communication in terms of railways, the airlines, the shipping and so on. We were not really mentally prepared to be one continent and to work with each other. And I think that is something that needs to be reversed. Even telephony. It is not easy to access, many African countries easily. So if we don't look at all these facets of infrastructure, then it is going to be harder to even do the trade eventually, even if we quickly get the free trade agreement signed and ratified by the majority of the African countries. So I think it is a mindset change among the leadership to really prioritize the continent and to know that our fate, first and foremost, is on the continent, and particularly the fate of the younger people. So it is a conversation that I think is gaining momentum, and it is a conversation that the progressive leaders, as well as the young people themselves, we need to put a lot of energy into it so that we can convince the bulk of the leadership that the time for us as a continent really focusing inward as we focus outward is now.
All right. Now, there has also been an argument that it is this time that the CFTA has an additive, exceptional additive, with the need of soft infrastructure. And this is coming mostly from the demand from the youth. How do we see now this need for the soft infrastructure actually creating more, ease for doing business across borders, and how do we even see this even prepping Africa for more competitiveness? Lionel, I'm coming to you because you are from an IT background, so soft infrastructure, yeah.
So my interpretation of soft infrastructure is what we cannot touch, yeah?
Definitely.
So as I said before, my business is doing things over the internet. So in our conversation earlier, the governor mentioned that businesses like Nakumatt or like Simba have a hard time trying to open a new branch somewhere. If Osamiti was to launch a product in, let's say, Uganda, we could do it by a push of a button because we don't face this kind of boundaries. What we do face, though, is the soft infrastructure that is over there. So I would say what we should focus on as the youth is right now, as the agreements are still being signed, right now as we're slowly progressing to actually having a clear picture of what's going to happen next, we should now focus on laying the ground to prepare for our businesses to expand. I would really suggest that we start thinking of how can we lower internet prices. These are governed by the telecoms, yes, but there are ways we could, pass around that to see how can we make internet more accessible to everyone. How can we have towers almost everywhere so that once we have our app in the air which allows people to sell potatoes, somebody from Congo can sell a potato to someone in Nigeria. Okay. So that is our responsibility.
Now, Joycey, maybe we move just a little bit away from the soft infrastructure to something else. Now, would you know that by 2030, the most growing industries or sectors generating a lot of income will be food and beverage. We're looking at about $397 billion expected by 2030 from food and beverages. Now, these are also some of the sectors that the youth are not being given a chance to step in. I mean, we know the likes of, I won't mention names, but big corporations on the continent with a lot of money even that are in this space. But if this is where we're seeing a lot of growth and the youth are not even given a chance to get in, what are we left with?
Well, I have to say, I think things are changing. I think the youth are actually entering the agribusiness, food sector. Agriculture is starting to look very attractive to a lot of youth. So that's a good thing. But I do think you're absolutely right. They say in Nigeria, for example, tomato paste. We have tomatoes in abundance in the northern part, but we literally import tomato paste. No one is setting up processing plants to process our tomatoes and turn them into a finished good. You know, same thing with jams, marmalades. We can do all those things. Africa is the food basket of the world, you know, and I feel as though policies have to be created to control these big dogs coming in and taking over the market and not giving indigenous players a chance. I wouldn't say that they should be pushed out, but there should be some kind of policy that basically establishes that they must work together with the local player. Give youth the opportunity to come in. If a youth, for example, I had an idea to create jams and marmalades. I wanted to create a processing plant. I know it takes capital. You know, if these big dogs have money and I don't, then I'm disadvantaged. But if they have to join forces with me, then that's a way forward to make sure that youth are involved in this sector as well, which is fast growing. And Africa has the ability to feed the rest of the world. So it's definitely a sector that the youth should be looking at.
All right, thank you very much. I think, Lionel, I see you want to add something, and so is the governor. But allow us to take a quick break here on the CNBC Africa Special report, of course, on the role that the youth are playing in the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and how this is expected to help growth on small and medium enterprises, but also business growth and free movement of people across borders. And we will return with a lot more, apparently, on that particular conversation that we were touching. So don't go anywhere. Keep it CNBC Africa. Welcome back to yet another edition of CNBC Africa's Special report. This time, we're looking at the role of the youth in implementing the Africa Continental Free Trade Area that is expected to boost intra-Africa trade to 52% in just about 4 to 5 years. Now, when we left off, we were speaking to Joycey, of course, from Oriki, and she was saying that Nigeria has rather a very big percentage of tomatoes grown in the north of the country, but they're still importing way too much tomato paste into the country. Now, we do know that the food and beverage sector will be growing to at least $397 billion by 2030. Now, the biggest problem to this is that these are one of the sectors that the youth actually find a hard time entering with their investment or even doing business in. Now, the question becomes, how do we make it even more simple or much easier for small and medium enterprises, for even startups to do a little bit of research on how to change this industry? Now, we're moving on to Governor Kivuta. And of course, thank you for creating time to speak to us. Just tell me, from where you stand, how do you see governments across Africa making it a lot easy to see much more youth involvement in such big sectors, actually sectors that are expected to be growing at these levels? $397 billion in 2030, that's a lot of money for the youth to miss out on.
I think in terms of the perennial problem that we say we have on the continent of food insecurity, if it was possible to, and it should be possible, to get the youth involved in food, the food chain, it would be easy to start to attack this problem of insecurity, because even within one country, as has been demonstrated, you have glut in one part of the country and you have need in another part of the country, and it is not easy to ensure there is marketing of the products so that they go to the other part of the country. And you can say the same for Africa as a whole, because like in Kenya, there are times we need maize, and there is maize in Tanzania, but sometimes because of the policies and how we are relating, it's not easy to get that maize to come from one country to the other country. And I have known many youth who want to do trade in grains, but because of those policies, again, they are not able to do that. When it comes to agribusiness, like in my county, we are already at a subnational level beginning to organize farmers so that there is a factory for mangoes and soon for oranges, to get juice. And the farmers now, instead of selling their fruits for nothing, they are now, selling them for good money to this factory. So if at the subnational level, you can get a government helping, farmers to get involved in mangoes and oranges and avocado, to get into honey, to get into milk production, to get into green grams, so that there is a factory where they are cleaned, they are split, they are packaged. So it's not rocket science. And actually, a lot of the people who are interested in these new things are young people, even encouraging their parents to allow them land, to allow them to, to farm, to do agribusiness, particularly where irrigation is involved, so that it doesn't take long and they can get money quickly. So I think we're still going back to the policies. We are going back to political will to really ignite the industrial revolution of Africa.
All right. Now, maybe I'll just move on to Joycey because she's quite closer to you and easy way of streamlining the conversation. Joycey, talk to me from a perspective of, all of this that we're talking about. Are we only seeing so much effort in bringing in foreign direct investment? Because, of course, much of the businesses that are involved in the food and beverage industry are not necessarily from Africa. I can give you examples, but I'd like to, stay neutral in that conversation. But do we see any sort of incentives to actually help the youth get into that space?
There are great incentives. I mean, we've answered them between the three of us on this panel so far. We've talked about how, the fact that Africa in itself is rich, and if we can actually process these resources that we have, we're actually adding value to the continent, right? There's no reason why we should send cocoa beans out to be processed into chocolate bars and come back to us. And this is an example that happens in so many industries. In my industry, which I call the agri-beauty industry, there are particular nuts that are produced into oils, and there are Western companies who actually have found these nuts and are making billions, millions, off of these cold pressed oils. Why isn't there a proudly African company or brand or young person basically playing a part, creating these companies, processing these nuts and these oils? I do think another issue when you talk about capital and the FDI, foreign direct investment that's coming in, is a lot of our banks on the continent need to do more and get more knowledge in investing in these sectors. Sometimes they say, we stay away from sectors that we don't understand. We don't understand agriculture. I'm an energy economist, that's my background. And I know in the power sector, when we privatized the power sector in Nigeria, it was a big deal. Banks started creating energy desks, started sending their bankers off for knowledge training, for learning, so they can actually know how they can play a role, how they can invest. So there's money within Africa, but I think financial institutions as well need to back these sectors and basically support indigenous people to be able to create businesses that they can also scale and compete with the FDIs.
All right. Lionel, of course, I just want you to give a quick comment about this, because in one way or another, it has somehow to affect this growing number of small and medium enterprises that we're seeing on the continent, but with a very limited chance of entering this particular sector. Is it that we don't necessarily have the knowledge about, this food and beverage, or don't we necessarily have, an entry point?
Actually, let me approach this in a startup point of view. Startups from Africa are going to look up to someone. This person is usually people from Silicon Valley. Now, the difference is startups in Silicon Valley are solving problems of the future. That is why they're into AI, they're into virtual reality and all those kind of things. But in Africa, we don't need to solve problems of tomorrow. We need to solve problems of now. Problems of now is Food, agriculture. Now, so to be fully honest with you, it's not attractive enough. It's not that we cannot do it or we don't have the skills to do it, but to startups who are looking up to Silicon Valley, it's not attractive enough to them. But we have had some change makers, right? I know of a startup in Rwanda who are making solar-powered irrigation kits for farmers, who instead of pumping water to their crops, they just wear a backpack with a solar panel and then they can just irrigate their crops easily. So I think that is a penetration point into this kind of thing. And I just think that if more and more entrepreneurs and innovators are just taught to look at what is now instead of starting to build big, we need e-commerce platforms, but let us first solve the problem that we have today: education, agriculture, things like that. Yeah, exactly. So we just need a shift of mindset. But I believe we can do it. I really do.
I believe that the governor is in agreement with you on that particular conversation. But the biggest area, of course, again, for growth at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area level is business-to-business spending. Now, this is expected to grow up to $4.2 trillion US by 2030, from just $1.6 trillion as of 2015. This could even happen a lot earlier. But what needs to be done to even have this happen in the first place?
First of all, Lionel deals with the internet, right? Internet of Things. Businesses need to get online. I need to know who the nut producers are in certain parts of the continent, right? So I have easy access to them, and I can facilitate the business-to-business aspect of my company, for example. I think we need to be able to allow for whatever the policies are in terms of incorporation at a national level, right? At a country level. Nigeria is doing a lot with trying to make it easier for people to register businesses, but I know in other countries, some of our neighbors, if I wanted to start a business there, it's very difficult. I would have to have a foreign national as a part of the board, a majority share, different things that make it difficult for me to want to incorporate in that company. So we need to start thinking of that ahead of time as well, opening the borders, opening incorporation so that people from different nationalities can go ahead and incorporate in other countries, and then be online so there's a presence. So I know when the doors are open, I know who I'm going for, where I'm going in Morocco, where I'm going in Kenya, where I'm going in Rwanda. It's the internet that would actually facilitate these things.
What's your take on this?
So on Monday, I took part in a very interesting session about breaking silos among us young innovators, and one of my co-panelists, Janet, mentioned something about partnerships. So the thing is, we cannot accomplish everything by ourselves. And just as she just mentioned that she needs to find out who she can work with maybe to accomplish something. So with this free trade, what I would want to see come out of it is, if I'm in Rwanda, yes, we have the ability to build software, but in Nigeria is maybe the biggest sales company. I would like it to be easy for us to partner together. They can sell my product in Guinea. We should start looking at this in that kind of way, but partnerships are key to this. And when I say partnerships, I mean working together, not the other way around. And so I believe partnerships are key for business-to-business corporations, and that is how both can grow. So my take is just partnerships.
Governor Kivuta, talk to me about the role of the governments, because we're talking about Africa. What is the role that the governments are actually playing to see that, the youth can get involved in such conversation? I mean, we're looking at that $4.2 trillion on business-to-business spending as part of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. But if it doesn't happen, then we are the ones that stand to lose the biggest number here. So how are the governments pushing to see that actually the youth get involved at such a level?
Mm-hmm. I think that perhaps at this point in time is something that is not being prioritized as such by the government, because from this conversation we have also noted that even at level of facilitating the free trade, free movement of persons, these questions of visas and all that, that is still not happening as much as, of course, it should be. So when most of the young people who are entrepreneurs are thinking of, first of all, developing themselves as single units before they begin to venture into other countries and to venture into collaboration with other businesses for synergy. So both the governments as well as also the young people maybe in this area at the same stage where the governments yet have not facilitated this opening, and the young people are developing their own enterprises first before they can now engage other partners from other African countries. But having said that, I think initially one found companies doing that, companies from abroad, because they're able to go to one country, go to another country, and then they would therefore make those linkages because they were operating from the mother company abroad. The young people are doing this slightly faster than the older entrepreneurs, because like in the IT sector, they make solutions, you know, sometimes, I think as he has remarked, you cannot, their borders don't work for them, because this IT thing, it's not going to be stopped at a customs post, and, you know, because it's really going from one country to another, and, you know, they know how to do that. So I think that is really, you know, what is required as a second step, so that there is therefore more synergy. You have bigger enterprises being built because of that kind of partnership, that kind of cooperation, and there is a sense in which the young people, the young entrepreneurs, have to go ahead of their governments in terms of making those networks among themselves, so that maybe later the laws and the policies will have to kind of follow, particularly in those areas where you can't constrain people easily.
All right. Joyce, now maybe some of my final questions, of course. According to the Harvard Business Review, it is estimated that Africa has the potential to become the world's manufacturing hub. On the other hand, China is expected to lose between 85 to 100 million jobs. And Africa is waiting to get this. But the question becomes, are the youth ready for these opportunities, or are they being readied for these opportunities?
From the youth perspective, I think the youth need to be aligning themselves with skill acquisition. When the CFTA is signed, as we mentioned several times over, jobs, there's employment opportunities, but what are the youth doing now to prepare themselves for those opportunities? And I think that there's a huge gap there. There's been, I think things are changing. Now there's more of a focus on skills acquisition, and not just the normal, I study one discipline, I go to school and I get this degree. There's also, people are starting to realize that there's also value in other types of jobs, in manufacturing and other types of industries as well. So I think youth needs to be thinking about that. I made a comment yesterday about how, we should never stop learning as youth, as young people. So there's nothing that should stop us from learning another industry, for example. Like I said, I'm an energy economist, but I'm now in agribusiness. I'm now in the agri-beauty sector. And specifically with manufacturing, I think one of the things that we're gonna have to handle as a continent, and also the national level, is electricity. Infrastructure is a problem. It costs so much to manufacture in the continent. When I started my business, I had to contract manufacture outside of the continent. And it's only recently that we began to manufacture on ground. And it may not even be Nigeria at the end of the day that we set up our factory. It may be another neighboring African country, because electricity is a problem as well. So one, I do believe that youth have more work to do in terms of getting ahead of the curve, continuous learning, online education, skills acquisition. And then also, I think on a governmental level, as a leadership level, we need to also work on the infrastructural issues that will cause challenges for the manufacturing sector to thrive.
Lionel, what's your take on this?
I would first also ask a question, just say how informed.
I hope that question isn't coming from me.
It's not yours. It's a rhetorical question. So how informed is the youth about what is happening? Because worst case scenario is the papers are signed, the borders are removed, and everything is ready, and then we're just sitting and watching. You would find that even though everything has been put in place, now we need 10 more years to learn, to train ourselves, to build these factories, to build the infrastructure, and then we have lost 10 years. And then what will happen is The bigger companies from the West and from Europe will come and set up base and then just do everything for us as we've been used to see it. So I would just take it back to say, in preparation, governments and us as entrepreneurs, as innovators, we should do as much as possible to inform the rest and to be prepared so that once everything is set, we are ready to go. Innovators are risk takers. We are entrepreneurs, we take risk every day. We should take a risk to build a factory to say, once this border is removed, I'll process tomatoes for Nigeria. So these are the kinds of things, these are the kind of ideas we should start thinking about. Yeah, because these papers are going to be signed eventually, and then worst case scenario is we're not ready for it, and this is being done for us.
You mentioned about, of course, building a factory and processing tomatoes for Nigeria, which needs a whole lot of that. But it's not just that conversation, because initially we were talking about the the cotton actually ecosystem. Because we know if Tanzania is growing coffee and it can be ginned in Uganda, and also the textile industry being in Nairobi, with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area coming in place, it could easily, loop this all together and make it very easy for the continent to grow. But then, coming back to the youth, one of the questions that I always wanted to ask is, do the youth actually understand the Africa Continental Free Trade Area itself, or do they even know how the AU works, or even are they welcome at the AU? I think let's go for the governor for this.
Mm-hmm. I think, as I tried to say earlier, when it comes to continental policies, programs, and so on, there isn't as much knowledge as perhaps national programs. And I am not saying that it should only be the responsibility of the AU to make sure that young people and anybody else understand what they do, because even national governments have a responsibility to get their citizens to know what is going on at a sub-regional level and at the regional level. But certainly that information is not readily available, and the mechanisms that are there should step up, particularly in the context of the free trade possibility soon. It is necessary for the African governments themselves to start preparing for it. For example, in terms of how do you support young people to be part of this? At national level, you have some affirmative action programs, like in Kenya. 30% of government business is supposed to be done by youth, by women, by persons with disability and other disadvantaged groups. So in the same way, one can say there is a fund to be set aside so that young people will be enabled when this free trade possibility comes on board, for them to be able to operate, particularly the startups, these companies that are really, doing great work even without a lot of support. So I think there is that aspect. As the youth prepare themselves, the governments need to prepare even before they sign, so that it's a reality. It is not just signed and then it is just a document.
Okay, now I think we've reached the end of this conversation. But of course, before I let you go, I would like to hear some closing remarks on what's the way forward for the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, for the youth, for business development on the continent, economic growth as well. I'll start from the governor and then we'll come towards myself.
Yes, it's good to start with the governor because he's an older person and this is really for the youth. Although I am a self-declared ambassador for the youth of Africa. I really think the question of opening up Africa so that all of us, and particularly the young people, can be able to move from one place to another. They can do their business, they can study, they can socialize, and all that. It's a very, very urgent issue. Given the kind of employment that we have, and given the possibilities that exist on the continent, and given that the youth are very creative, they're innovative, they are really, they can make us go to the next step. So this is extremely urgent, and my plea is to both at the AU level and the national leaderships of the continent to really prioritize this aspect, because even some of these conflicts we're having and so on, because of disappointments of young people and so on, if we operate within that large theater, then some of these things can be a matter of the past.
All right.
I think we're on the cusp of a demographic dividend or a demographic disaster. Our youth are the major population of Africa, and it is essential that we empower the youth. And I think when we look at the AfCFTA, I notice a huge knowledge gap. There's not enough dissemination of information about the importance of this agreement, of this area. And I believe that it's high time that governments do something about sharing the education to the youth, explaining to them what this is and what this means for them. When that happens, we will begin to see young people jump on the bandwagon, and they will even see a way out. They'll begin to see opportunities for themselves, and they'll all be lobbying for the ratification of this agreement. I think it's extremely urgent, as the governor said. For me, I'm patiently waiting, but I'm not letting anything stop me from continuing to press forward in the meantime. But I do know that the moment that the borders are open, I am now put on a platform to be able to thrive globally as a young person in my business. And I'm able to trade with my brothers and sisters and actually truly engage other countries as brothers and sisters and do free trade. And I think the time is now for us to all take this as an urgent matter and lobby our policymakers.
All right.
To me, one of the biggest benefits I see from the Continental Free Trade is the open movement. I believe one of the biggest boosts of innovation is exposure. If young people are exposed to different cultures in Africa, to how things are done in other parts of Africa, then we start innovating past ourselves. We start innovating past one state. We start innovating in the context of Africa. We start thinking to solutions which can not only work in one place, but which can work Africa-wide, and this is development.
All right. Thank you very much. Of course, a big thank you to my guests tonight, Governor Kivutha Kibwana from Makueni County in Kenya, and of course, Joyce Awoshika of Oriki. She is the Managing Director of Oriki in Lagos, and our own Lionel Mfizi, CEO of Osamiti Labs here in Kigali. The conversations on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, of course, are still ongoing on a continental level. But for us at CNBC Africa, we'll put a pause on things here on this edition of CNBC Africa Special Report. But more is going on the channel, so remember to tweet us at CNBC Africa. My personal handle, as always, is at Galwera4. Are we yet to see an actualization on the 52% that is expected to grow as of intra-Africa trade through this Africa Continental Free Trade Area? And how are the youth actually taking part in these conversations? Of course, much more on CNBC Africa. First in business, worldwide.